caffeinated conflict, coffee in the First World War. So the role of kind of war and coffee might seem a kind of an odd combination, but what I want to do is sort of look through the ways in which we might think about those connections and the way in which war affects coffee, and coffee to some extent affects war, and as we'll see, causes states to think about their alliances. So here we have actually the starting point for this talk, because this is one of the Buchler pictures, and you see here, I would imagine, a volunteer from the reserve, a voluntary organisation sort of serving coffee as the wounded get back from the front. So as the kind of the first sort of symbol of home, a very sort of comfort thing, and I think there's a lot to be said about comfort and about the sort of the meanings that we attach to things. So I want to start with this point. So I'm not a First World War historian. I am an Italian historian, and that will become significant in a minute. But I am most of all a coffee historian. And since the last time we did this presentation, I actually finished writing and published this book, Coffee, A Global History. And if I were trying to sell the book, and goodness knows I might be, I would say that the line of the book would be, how did the world acquire a taste for coffee? In other words, the idea is, how does coffee spread around the world? But coffee tastes so different throughout the world because we all have our own ways of drinking coffee, and how do those ways evolve and become sort of fixed, as it were? And in very simple terms, I guess what I tried to do was analyse what you might call coffee world systems, the ways that not only that we have a chain between production and consumption, but the ways that those then shift profoundly. And I would say very briefly that there are 5 eras in world coffee, and the easiest way to think of them, or world coffee history, and the easy way to think of them is as varieties of the way that we called coffee. So coffee starts, for me, number one, as the sort of the wine of Islam, if you like. It's the beverage for its first 200 years is essentially distributed around the Muslim diaspora around the Red Sea. So between the Ottoman Empire in the north and down to India and around the whole of the Gulf, through the center being in Yemen, where we have coffee being grown, and in Ethiopia, where wild coffee is harvested. The second phase is really of coffee as a colonial good, when we, the Europeans, and we're all implicated, acquire a taste for coffee and start planting coffee around the world to satisfy that taste, whether that's in Asia, Africa, or in Latin America. And then very briefly, and I'll talk about them a bit more, we have coffee becoming an industrial product, coffee in an industrial era. Very much, as we'll see, a symbiosis of the relationship between two countries, the United States and Brazil. Coffee is a global commodity when we see coffee being consumed essentially in what we might call the global north and grown in the global south, and the kind of the specialty beverage era that we have today, when, as many of you know, and I frequently demonstrate, coffee has become a lifestyle product, a kind of a sort of a thing with which it has a new investment of fashion, as opposed to simply being the mass consumer good that it was. So don't worry, I won't be testing you on that, but I want to talk about war and coffee in 2 ways. War as an agent of changing coffee tastes. And there are ways that obviously war disrupts trade routes, and it's disrupted trade routes and trading for many years. The first instance of this that one can really think of, or a very important instance from the European perspective, is the Napoleonic blockades. France was in fact the chief user of coffee in Europe, and the chief grower of coffee for that matter overseas during the 18th century. In the 19th century, when we have the beginnings of the 19th century, the Napoleonic Wars, as we know, the British blockade in response to the continental system, blockade, as it were, imports into Europe through their naval blockade. One of those consequences of that is it's a lot more difficult, clearly, to ship in coffee to Europe. And that certainly promotes the use of blending, or as you write, stretching your coffee supply by blending in chicory to your coffee. Chicory being sort of roasted. And that remains a characteristic of our coffees in various ways. We still call French coffee, and to be blunt here, what I'm saying is we in English talk of something called French coffee, particularly in fact if we're from the United States, meaning coffee and chicory, meaning that that is actually what we understand French coffee to be. And indeed, there's good reason for that. So you'll see here is William Ukers in his book All About Coffee. In 1935, Ukers was probably the last man who knew everything there was to know about coffee, as it were. He was the editor of the Tea and Coffee Trade Journal, wrote this huge volume. And here's Ukers' impressions of Europe, which was that, you know, chicory isn't an adulterant. It's not something that you, therefore, that it's a false thing in coffee. It's what you actually put in to make it the taste that you want. An addition or a modifier. And so many people acquired that taste that actually it's doubtful if they would appreciate a real cup of coffee, should they ever meet it. And I'll give you that date again, 1935, yeah. Okay, so, talked about the eras of coffee and the war as a contributor, as an agent of changing coffee eras. And the key one is this one, the American Civil War. During the American Civil War, the use of coffee became profound amongst the Union troops. They were issued with a ration of about 36 pounds of coffee a year, something like that. I'm trying to do my maths, but what it actually boils down to is that you could probably find troops in the field, in the Union field, drinking about 10 cups of coffee a day. Coffee was the thing for several reasons. Coffee, of course, we know it has those psychoactive effects. It makes you feel more awake. It gives you your coffee rush. And it has that kind of warmth and comfort feel to it, so it fulfills a key morale need. This is a quote from a man who wrote a book called Hardtack and Coffee as his memoir of the Civil War. And if you see here, he's basically pointing out, you know, if there's a march, you have to have coffee beforehand. If there's a halt, you make coffee. You have coffee at the meal, so your meal is accompanied by coffee, something that Americans still seem to do today, and coffee is drunk between the meals. And the key point here is the old soldiers who can stand it are the hardest coffee drinkers in the community. In other words, this created the basis for the expansion of mass coffee drinking in the United States, created that kind of thirst and taste for coffee. So in that way, war can have a dramatic change. And to show you sort of how dramatic that change is, if we look at coffee consumption, if you look at the table on the left there, you'll see that from 1860 is really the point that coffee consumption, particularly consumption per capita, really zooms up in the States. Now, I'm not saying that's all because of the war, but what I'm saying is the war creates the first demand. That created the possibilities for starting to produce coffee on an industrial level. So we see a lot of developments in coffee roasting, coffee packaging, mass coffee, and coffee as a business on its own in the 1860s, the start of coffee brands in America, and the way that America becomes an absolute dominant mass market, the first mass market for coffee. And that mass market is fueled by the growth of the world's greatest coffee supplier, which is Brazil. And again, if you have a look at Brazil's world production on the right there, and the percentage of world production that Brazil represents, and you'll see it peaks just before the First World War in the years that I've chosen here at around 77%, and indeed there are years subsequent to that where probably Brazil produces 80. Certainly 1906 we know Brazil produced over 80% of the entire world's coffee. And it sent most of that to be drunk in the US. So to show you what that might look like visually, it looks like this. The world's biggest coffee entrepot, if you like, or coffee export port, is on the left there. That's Santos in Brazil. They're dropping coffee, sacks of coffee, down into an underground channel where it will land and be transported direct onto a ship. So you literally just take the coffee off the railway, throw it down the channel, and off it goes out onto the steamer. Santos becomes the world's biggest coffee port, and the cup of Joe becomes born as Americans' way of drinking coffee. Lots of coffee. Lots and lots and lots of coffee. So by now, we need to think about, what do you do when the United States goes to war? And this is where things become interesting. So the US Army does buy up a lot of coffee, but of course it has to try and make that coffee available to its soldiers. And in the period 1914 to 18, the most effective way of doing that, or the way that that was done, was through the development of this George Washington's instant coffee. George Washington, actually, surprisingly enough, was not the George Washington you might expect, but a Belgian who was called George Washington, who lived in the States and had a coffee company. This is really true. I was gobsmacked by this as well. But this supposedly instant, in other words, creating coffee as a soluble product, that obviously means that this can be supplied to troops very easily and transported very easily. And so when the American army comes over and enters the war in 17, they bring with them loads of George Washington coffee. And there are some great tributes to George Washington's coffee. Some guy writes a letter home saying, you know, when I get back home off the boat, the first person I'm going to go and meet is George Washington and tell him it was a damn fine coffee. So, fantastic. We'd think that might be a major innovation in coffee. It also has a major distribution effect, because actually that coffee is drunk. As you can see here, this is a Salvation Army refuge for US troops during the First World War. They also distribute that coffee fairly often to their allies in the field. There are pictures of Italians drinking huge mugs of American George Washington coffee. But there's one thing that's very interesting about George Washington's coffee. It completely disappears after the war. So this is a moment when you might think coffee, in fact I think George Washington went bankrupt in about the 20s. It's a moment when you might think coffee, technology and so forth changes, but it doesn't. We don't embrace it. And we'll come back to thinking about that as sort of, you know, how much the First World War does and doesn't change. What it certainly does change, of course, is the pattern of international trade, and in particular, what happens to Brazil. Brazil, as I said, was exporting 75 to 80% of world coffee. As the blockades hit, so Brazil's ability, and indeed that of all the Latin American countries, to export coffee into Europe is dramatically hit. And you can see in effect the success particularly of the submarine wars from 1916 on, when you see that massive drop in coffee supply. Yeah. And it does in fact take, and this is really a little bit of extras, but it takes until 1930 until you get back, for Brazil to get back to those 11 million sacks going into Europe. So Brazil has a massive problem because it has a lot of coffee that it doesn't know where to place. And the same applies also to those other Latin American states that are beginning to grow coffee, including Guatemala. And I mention Guatemala because Guatemala, and I'm trying to not step on anything you say, Chantal, so shut me up if I say too much. But Guatemala was the other country that particularly supplied Germany with coffee. There are a lot of Germans, émigré Germans, in the coffee trade. The richest coffee grower in Brazil was of German heritage, a guy called Francesco Schmidt, who owned 7 million coffee trees. Right? 7 million. Guatemala, by the time you get to export, about 50% of the Guatemalan export trade was in the hands of Germans or emigre Germans by 1914. Well, that trade can't last. And so that Central American trade also diverts to the States, which creates further problems for Brazil and for those countries. Lots of coffee, even the Americans can only drink so much of it. Price problems. How do you manage this? One of the ways of doing that was, of course, to get the Americans to guarantee some buying of coffee and some support for the price. And in 1917, miraculously, Brazil decided to go into the First World War. And the pretext for this, which I mean is a reasonable one, I suppose, is that a Brazilian boat, as you can see here from my Wikipedia history, transporting coffee is sunk. But the reality, I suspect, is actually because Brazil is that dependent on America and that dependent on that coffee market that, frankly, it makes good sense for them to enter the war and secure that basic level of pricing and potential to continue exporting. Now, and we're getting close to talking about where we should be, that has a very unexpected outcome. What started me thinking about coffee in the First World War was this real surprise to me that comes from another of the events that the Centre organised and from a community collaborator. So this is my snatched shot on a day when we just talked about the effects of the First World War on business, where one of our local community experts had been working on the West Herts and Watford Observer. So she was working on shopping in Watford. And she showed this advert, which came out in 1917 for the Imperial stores in Watford. And you'll see it tells you how to win the war, etc. And the first is go and buy national war bonds. And the second is drink coffee for breakfast. What the hell is going on here? We all know what the British are. The British are a tea nation, yes? The British, after all, have grown their tea consumption from 1.9 pounds in 1851 to 6.5 pounds in 1911. Thank you for that stat, Rachel. And have become in that period, and actually the 1851 thing is not insignificant because that's when the major coffee producing area that Britain, as it were, had colonised, Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, was hit by a virulent form of coffee rust, and the coffee wiped out and it was replanted as tea. So there's actually sort of quite a lot of global connection here. Anyway, so Britain is a tea drinking country, we all know that. And as Rachel again has reminded us, by 1899 the army had officially recognised that tea was the national beverage and you made tea for soldiers and that's what you put in the trenches. Though there was this other thing, and this is camp coffee. Yeah, some of us will remember camp coffee or have used it to make cakes with or whatever. And camp coffee is actually is referred to as coffee essence, and was made by a company called Patterson's in Glasgow, and was really, their boom was indeed sending this out to let's call it the imperial markets, particularly sort of South Africa, India, for use there. Camp coffee, you would usually either add water or more commonly actually milk and boil the result to make something that you might call coffee. You might call it coffee, it had no coffee in it. Camp coffee is made with chicory, and chicory becomes a very important part of our story. Chicory the main source of chicory in Europe was Belgium and northern Germany. So I went to have a look at Patterson's archives. So the main source of chicory, Belgium, and I believe the north of Germany. I don't know so much about Germany, but I can tell you that the main source at all was Belgium, right? So Paterson's, I thought, I'll have a look in their archive and have a poke around and find, what are Paterson's doing in 1940? And I thought they'd be all right because, the coffee is still flowing over from our perspective at that point. No, Paterson's are absolutely terrified because their main source of supply has just gone, right? How are they going to get their chicory? So Paterson's actually have a real problem during the war because of that disruption. I believe, in fact, that they began bringing chicory in from South Africa as an alternative source, but I can't substantiate that beyond a little bit at the moment. So, in our tea drinking nation, we have a big problem by 1917 because, again, as the submarine and naval blockade becomes more pronounced, so it's very difficult now to bring in tea, and you'll see that the quantity of tea goes down to 35% of that was the level of import previously. So by the end of 1917, there is a real problem with tea supply. And this is why I began to get interested in local food committees, because the local food committees introduced rationing of tea. So Malvern, which is the one that I read, sort of introduced basically 1 ounce, I think it would be 1 ounce of tea a day as a ration, which would be half what the normal demand was. So the other thing that they were charged with, and I really hadn't realised this, was that they could actually intervene and control prices. That's what happened in Malvern in the first place. So that's the prices. I'm sorry that these figures don't quite stack up, but they're how they were given. Tea, and I've translated them into D here rather than try you with shillings and pence. So 19D is 19 old pence, as it were. 32D is 32 old pence. So coffee and tea in June 14 were actually the same price per pound. Now that actually also surprised me. I thought that per pound coffee would be more expensive. And it makes me wonder a little bit about, or it makes, I think, it clear how much the British preference for tea, as opposed to merely an economic argument for using tea, was important. As you can see, by 1918, tea has moved away from coffee. Tea has become more expensive, and indeed over the course of the conflict, if we go through to 1920, whereas tea has gone up 92%, coffee has only gone up by 50%. All of which might make you think that we'd turn into a coffee, become more appreciative of coffee. Now that's why, if we put those factors together, Brazil comes into the war, lots more coffee that it wants to get rid of. It's on our side. We don't have much tea, trying to ration it. That's why we have those ads telling us we should drink coffee for breakfast in 1917. Does it work? Well, not really. It'll take a long time before the Brits start becoming coffee drinkers. And again, after the war, if there was any change, it disappears very rapidly. Yeah. So I've talked about control prices, and I want to talk about that in another context here. But I want to talk a little bit about Italian coffee culture, and I'd hope to have a more inspiring picture than that, but this picture actually has a pretty good story to it. So Italians think that they, oh sorry Francesco, Italians think they own coffee culture. But actually Italian coffee culture was, in terms of coffee consumption, very low per capita before the First World War. And they're reasons to do with income, but mostly I would say actually the reasons are to do with two things, which is agriculture, because Italy was a very, very agrarian country, and coffee is not really an agrarian drink. Coffee is an urban drink. So there were people drinking coffee in the cities but not in the countryside. To tell you how much coffee they thought they were drinking, when they did a survey in Rome, in the area called Testaccio, which is a very working class area of Rome, in 1910, they claimed to be drinking coffee every day. They were drinking chicory every day. I'm sorry, because they were drinking coffee, like caffè latte, made with coffee powder, which would be chicory, boiled up with milk. But the notion of that as coffee is quite significant. Now, when Italy went into the First World War, 1915, the Italian army started ordering up and created a mass roastery at Genova and brought in lots more coffee. So for many soldiers, the first time they would have tasted real coffee was actually in the Italian army. And the Italian army issued them with this type of grinder. And if you go to the army camps, and actually, I mean, this is obviously a beautiful replica that's still being made today, but I have actually seen the originals, which are big canister type grinders, and sort of units were issued with these. And again, you've got to remember that the Italian army were fighting up in the mountains, not in trenches in the normal way that we think of. And they would be grinding their coffee. If they did, for whatever reason, their grinder wasn't there, it's reported that they would just kind of grind the coffee against the rocks in order to make the coffee. So there's a very interesting thing here about Italian coffee culture and exposure in the sense of many more people drinking coffee for the first time. And there's another factor to that, and that is the origins of Italian coffee culture and the great mysteries of Italian coffee culture to those of us not born in Italy, or indeed many who are. Why on earth do Italians stand up at the bar? Why don't they have a chair? Haven't they ever thought of a waiter? Well, of course, there are reasons, and the reasons go back to what happened just before the First World War. So in 1911, a list of articles that you could, in times of emergency, institute as a council a maximum price for was introduced. And that was widely first made use of during the First World War. And one of those 21 articles was, quote, coffee without service. Just your cup of coffee, right? Now, it's a strange thing when I've just told you that there wasn't that much coffee drinking going on. But of course, if you were working in a ministry, coffee at the bar was definitely something that you wanted. Yeah. So, coffee without service. How do you do coffee without service? Well, if you just pass the coffee over the counter, there's coffee without service. And if you have nowhere to sit, and no kind of other stuff, then that's your coffee without service. So if there's a maximum price for coffee without service, you certainly aren't going to put any service in there. Now, as those of you who go to Italy and have made this mistake will know, if you sit down, you've actually created service, and you might well get charged double for that service, which is why everyone stands. And this price, which was of course supposed to be an emergency price, gradually became part of the sort of the fixed notion of how Italian coffee culture worked, particularly as it happened under the fascist regime, where the price became part of the whole section of corporate controls of the economy. And that bit survived quite nicely into the post-war era, because actually what that fixed price does is make it very difficult to set up coffee chains and all those kinds of things that we are so used to, because it keeps the price so low that actually it's not worth getting into the business. So that is another thing that we owe to the First World War. Magari. Anyway, what am I saying here? I'm saying that the behavioural impacts of the war certainly generates a new thirst for coffee amongst some sections of the troops. That's often actually fulfilled by using substitutes. And if we go into the 30s, we'll see again that more and more actually what comes out of, if you like, Europe's industrial coffee culture is the use of substitutes, coffee brands. We see a very quick post-war revision, really, almost an intensification to drinking coffee and the styles of coffee that people are used to as a way of, I think, reasserting, and in the British case, tea, reasserting a national sort of identity. We're back with our emotional thing. We have to wait, really, for that big technological era shifting moment until effectively the Second World War. And that's why I'm ending with this slide. So all of the things that I've described happen again, in effect, in the Second World War with much greater intensity, including the fact that Brazil has far too much coffee and the US Army has to take a lot of coffee over into Europe somehow if it's going to fight. And Nestlé, meanwhile, have been working on soluble coffee, having originally been commissioned by Brazil to do so. And by the time they crack it in 1938, well, this is a bit of a problem also for a market anywhere. So a nice deal is done between Nestlé to market their new product called Nescafé to the US Army. So Europeans, including, and perhaps most notably Brits, finally get to taste or become more excited by coffee because Nescafé is brought back in to Europe by the American GIs in the Second World War, and that's where we start drinking soluble coffee. So that seems to me how the overall progress of the caffeinated conflict works. I've avoided saying anything about Germany other than the very basics because there's a lot more to say about Germany, and I'm looking forward to hearing Chantal give us the kind of specifics and the more detailed stuff, but I hope that was helpful for you.